He walked out of the courthouse with nothing. The house, the money, everything no longer had his name on it, so a veteran Navy SEAL drove back into the northern forest with only his dog beside him. He didn't go there to rebuild his life. He went there to disappear quietly. But the moment they arrived, his German Shepherd stopped, staring at a single spot like it already knew. What the dog led him to wasn't treasure. It was a buried bunker tied to his own father. Inside was a secret that could destroy a man's past or finally bring it to light. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Veteran Dog Stories. Caleb Vance stepped out of the courthouse into a morning that looked too clean to belong to him. The sunlight spilled across the concrete steps, bright and indifferent, as if the world had decided to move forward without waiting for his permission. It warmed the pavement, lit the windows, softened the edges of passing strangers. But it never quite reached him. At 43, Caleb still carried the posture of a man trained to endure. He stood tall at about 6'1", shoulders squared by years of military discipline, his frame lean but hardened like something carved and reforged more than once. His face was all angles, sharp jawline, high cheekbones, and a faint layer of stubble clung to his skin. Not careless, just unimportant. His eyes, a deep blue-gray, didn't wander. They observed, measured, held. They had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. No one followed him out. No one called his name. The divorce had ended the way a quiet storm ends. No thunder, no spectacle, just a slow, inevitable unraveling. There had been no shouting inside that courtroom. No accusations thrown like knives. Just signatures, a few careful sentences from a lawyer, and the sound of something final closing between two people who once shared everything. The house was no longer his. The joint accounts were sealed. Even the phone had gone quiet. No missed calls, no messages waiting. It wasn't that everything had been taken. It was that everything had let go. Caleb paused for a moment at the bottom of the steps, the sunlight pressing gently against his jacket. An olive field jacket, worn at the seams, the fabric softened by years of weather and movement. Beneath it, a red and dark blue plaid shirt, dark cargo pants, brown leather boots that had outlived more roads than he cared to count, a military watch still wrapped around his wrist, ticking with a kind of stubborn loyalty time itself rarely honored. He adjusted the strap of the Eberlestock half-track backpack on his shoulder, then exhaled slowly. "All right," he murmured under his breath, though there was no one to hear it. Except there was. Coda waited inside the truck. The German Shepherd sat upright in the passenger seat, ears forward, body still but alive with awareness. At 5 or 6 years old, Coda was in that quiet peak between youth and age. Muscles lean and defined beneath a dense black and tan coat, every movement precise, controlled. He wasn't restless. He wasn't anxious. He was watching. When Caleb opened the door, Coda leaned forward slightly, his deep, focused eyes locking onto Caleb's face as if reading something no one else could see. "Just paperwork, huh?" Caleb said quietly, one corner of his mouth lifting just enough to hint at something that might have once been humor. Coda's tail moved once. Slow, measured, Caleb climbed in, shut the door, and for a moment neither of them moved. The engine idled. The world passed by outside the windshield. People with places to go, lives still intact. Coda shifted closer, placing the weight of his head gently against Caleb's shoulder. That was all. No noise, no urgency, just presence. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. "Yeah," he said under his breath. "Guess it's just you and me now." He didn't look back when he drove away. The road north stretched long and quiet, carrying them out of the city and into something older, something slower. Buildings thinned into open land, Asphalt gave way to narrower highways, then to winding roads that cut through forests where sunlight filtered down in soft, broken patterns. By the time Caleb turned off onto the final dirt path, the world had changed. Tall pine trees stood like silent sentries on either side of the road, their branches whispering in the wind. The air smelled different here. Cleaner, sharper, touched with earth and resin. Light poured through the canopy in long golden beams, painting the ground in shifting shapes. It was beautiful. It was also too quiet. Caleb slowed the truck as the clearing came into view. The cabin stood where he remembered it, though time had not been kind. The wood had faded to a dull gray-brown. The porch sagged slightly on one side. The roof held, but barely. Tall grass and wild growth had claimed what used to be a yard. It looked smaller than it had in his memory. Everything did. He killed the engine. For a moment, neither he nor Coda moved. Then Caleb opened the door and stepped out. The ground felt solid beneath his boots. Real. Unchanging. Coda jumped down beside him, but instead of exploring, instead of running or sniffing with curiosity, the dog froze. Completely. His body stiffened. Ears sharpened, head angled slightly, and his gaze fixed on something beyond the cabin. Caleb followed that line of sight. Behind the house, rising gently toward the tree line, was a low hill covered in moss, scattered rocks, and patches of sunlit grass. Nothing unusual, nothing moving, just a hill. Coda didn't move, didn't bark, didn't even blink. Caleb frowned slightly. "What is it?" No response. Coda took one slow step forward, then stopped again, as if hitting an invisible boundary. Caleb watched him for a long moment, then shook his head lightly. "Yeah, all right. We'll check it later." But Coda didn't look away. The inside of the cabin smelled like dust and memory. Caleb pushed the door open with a firm shoulder, the hinges protesting in a long, tired creak. Sunlight cut through the windows, illuminating floating particles in the air. The layout hadn't changed. Small living room, stone fireplace, a wooden table, narrow hallway leading to 2 bedrooms. Everything was still there. Just abandoned. Caleb set his pack down and walked slowly through the space, his boots echoing softly against the worn floorboards. His hand brushed across the table, leaving a clean line through the dust. "Home," he said quietly. The word felt unfamiliar. Behind him, Coda entered but didn't explore like before. He moved through the room with controlled precision, nose low, checking corners, edges, doorways, methodical, trained. But every few seconds, he glanced back toward the door, toward the hill. Hours passed. Caleb worked without thinking, opened windows, swept debris, cleared space near the fireplace. The rhythm of movement helped. It always had. In the field, after missions, after things went wrong. Keep moving. Don't think too much. Don't feel too much. By late afternoon, the cabin looked less abandoned. Not restored. Not alive, but usable. Caleb stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands against his cargo pants. The sun had begun to lower, casting long shadows across the clearing. The forest seemed to breathe in a different rhythm now, slower, deeper. Coda stood at the edge of the yard, facing the hill, still. A sudden gust of wind moved through the trees. Not strong, but sharp enough to ripple through the grass and send a low, hollow sound across the clearing. Coda reacted instantly, not with fear, with certainty. He moved forward, quick, silent, stopping halfway between the house and the hill. His nose lifted into the air, catching something invisible, something carried on that brief current of wind. Then he lowered his head. and let out a low, almost inaudible growl. Not aggressive, not defensive, recognizing. Caleb felt it before he understood it. A shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. The kind of feeling that didn't come from logic, but from something deeper. Something older. "What is it, boy?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Coda didn't look at him. He took another step toward the hill, then stopped, and sat, like a soldier holding position, waiting. Caleb stared at the dog, something tightening in his chest. Coda had never done anything without reason. Not once. Caleb glanced back at the cabin, then toward the tree line, then back at the hill. There was nothing there. No movement, no sound, no sign of anything out of place. And yet, Coda refused to move. Caleb exhaled slowly. "All right," he muttered. "Tomorrow." He turned and walked back toward the cabin. But the feeling didn't leave him. That quiet shift, that sense of something just beneath the surface. Night settled gently over the forest. Inside, the fire crackled low in the stone fireplace. Caleb sat in an old wooden chair, one leg stretched out, his hand resting loosely near the knife in his pocket out of habit more than need. Coda lay near the door. Not asleep, never fully asleep. Every so often, his ears twitched, adjusted, listened. Caleb watched the flames for a long time, his thoughts drifting where he didn't want them to go. The courtroom. Miriam's face. The way she had looked at him. Not angry, not cruel. Just done. He rubbed the back of his neck slowly. "Funny thing," he murmured. "Thought I'd feel something bigger." Coda didn't move. "I mean, after all that?" Silence. Caleb let out a quiet breath. "Guess I used it all up already." The fire shifted. Popped. Outside, something moved through the trees. Not loud. Not close. But enough. Coda was on his feet instantly. No bark, no warning. He moved to the door, nose low, body tense. Caleb straightened, every muscle responding without hesitation. Old instincts didn't fade. They waited. "What is it?" he whispered. Coda stood still, listening. Then, slowly, his head turned. Not toward the trees, toward the hill. Again. Caleb followed his gaze, even though the wall blocked the view. The feeling returned. Stronger now. Not fear, not yet. Just the undeniable sense that something out there hadn't been waiting for him. It had been waiting for them. Caleb Vance worked through the morning without speaking. The steady rhythm of his hands, replacing the noise that used to live in his head. The porch boards creaked under his weight as he pried loose warped planks and replaced them one by one, each movement deliberate, controlled. The kind of work that didn't ask questions. Sunlight filtered through the tall northern pines, scattering gold across the yard. It was the kind of place people imagined when they thought about peace. Quiet. Clean air. Nothing chasing you. But Caleb had learned something a long time ago. Silence didn't always mean safety. Coda moved in slow circles around the edge of the property, his nose low, his body coiled with quiet tension. He didn't wander far, didn't chase squirrels or react to birds. Every few steps, he stopped, head tilting slightly, ears adjusting, then returned his attention to the same direction. The hill. Caleb noticed it without acknowledging it. Like a pain you didn't touch because you already knew it was there. By late morning, he climbed down from the porch and wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. The sun had risen higher now, warming the clearing, but there was still a chill beneath the surface air, a coolness that clung close to the ground, especially near the tree line. Coda stood about 30 yards out, staring. still staring. Caleb let out a slow breath. "You're not letting that go, are you?" The dog didn't respond. Of course he didn't. Caleb grabbed a canteen from his pack, took a long drink, then started toward the edge of the clearing. The grass brushed against his cargo pants as he moved, dry at the tips but damp underneath from the night's moisture. As he approached, Coda shifted slightly, not retreating, not advancing, just adjusting his stance like he was making room, like he had been waiting. Caleb stopped beside him and looked toward the slope. Up close, it didn't look any different. Moss, scattered rocks, thin roots pushing through the soil. A few patches of exposed dirt where rain had washed things down over time. Nothing unusual. But Coda lowered his head and sniffed again, deeper this time, slower, then pawed once at the ground. Not digging, testing. Caleb crouched beside him, his eyes scanning the surface. "You smell something?" Coda's tail didn't move. His body remained tense. Caleb reached out, brushing aside a thin layer of moss with his fingers. The earth beneath was darker, compacted. He pressed his palm against it. Cold. Colder than it should have been. He frowned slightly, then pushed himself back to his feet. "Could be anything," he muttered. "Old roots, water underneath." But he didn't sound convinced. Coda didn't move. It was sometime after noon when Caleb heard the sound of an engine. Not close, not loud. But out here, even distant noise carried differently. Cleaner, sharper, impossible to ignore. Coda reacted instantly. His head snapped toward the dirt road leading into the clearing, ears high, body angled forward. This time, his focus broke from the hill. Caleb turned, narrowing his eyes as a truck slowly came into view through the trees. It was old, dust-coated, the kind of vehicle that belonged to someone who didn't care about appearances anymore. The truck rolled to a stop near the edge of the clearing, engine idling for a moment before shutting off completely. The door opened with a creak. The man who stepped out moved slowly, like someone used to conserving energy rather than wasting it. He was in his early 70s, tall but slightly stooped, his frame lean to the point of fragility. His face was deeply lined, the skin weathered from years outdoors, and a thin gray beard traced his jaw unevenly. His eyes, though, pale blue and sharp, missed nothing. He wore a brown canvas jacket, faded almost to ash at the shoulders, over a red flannel shirt, dark trousers, old boots that had seen more seasons than most men cared to count. He took one look at Coda, then at Caleb. "Didn't think anyone would come back here," the man said, his voice low and rough, like gravel dragged across wood. Caleb straightened. "Didn't think I would either." The man gave a faint nod. "Name's Jonah. Jonah Creed. Caleb Vance." Jonah's gaze shifted back to Coda, lingering there longer than necessary. Not with fear, not with curiosity. Recognition. "That dog yours?" he asked. Caleb glanced down briefly. "Yeah." Jonah stepped a little closer, careful, measured. "He's not just any dog." Caleb didn't respond. Jonah exhaled softly, then said it, casually, like it wasn't something he'd been holding on to for years. "Does he spend much time looking at that hill?" Caleb's jaw tightened just slightly. He didn't answer. Didn't need to. Jonah nodded once, as if the silence confirmed more than words ever could. "Figured." The air between them shifted. Caleb studied the older man now, really looked at him. "You been out here long?" "Long enough." Jonah's eyes drifted past Caleb toward the hill, long enough to know when something's not right. Coda let out a low breath. Jonah heard it. Turned his head just enough. "He hears it too, doesn't he?" Caleb's voice dropped. "Hears what?" Jonah didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped back, rubbing his hands together like he was brushing off something invisible. "Land remembers things," he said finally. "People forget. Land doesn't." Caleb's expression hardened. "You gonna explain that?" Jonah gave a small, tired smile. "Not today." He turned toward his truck. "If that dog starts digging," Jonah added without looking back, "you might want to pay attention." Then he got in, started the engine, and drove away. Just like that. The afternoon stretched longer than Caleb expected. He tried to get back to work, but the rhythm was gone now. Every few minutes, his eyes drifted back to the hill, to the place where Coda had stood, to the place Jonah had looked at like he knew something. Coda returned to his patrol, but something had changed. He moved faster now, less cautious, more certain. As the sun began to dip, painting the tops of the trees in deeper gold, Caleb finally set his tools aside. "All right," he muttered. "Let's take a closer look." Coda was already moving before he finished the sentence. They crossed the clearing together, the air cooling slightly as shadows stretched longer across the ground. When they reached the base of the hill, Caleb paused. Up close, the silence felt different, thicker, like sound didn't travel the same way here. Coda climbed halfway up, then stopped. He turned his head, not toward Caleb this time, but toward a patch of ground slightly off to the left, a place that looked no different from the rest. Then he stepped forward and pawed at it, once, twice, and then stopped, waiting. Caleb moved up beside him, crouching again. He brushed aside the moss more carefully this time, digging his fingers deeper into the soil. Something scraped against his knuckles. Metal. He froze, not moving for a second. Then slowly, deliberately, he cleared more dirt away. A narrow edge, flat, cold, straight. Not natural. Caleb sat back slightly, his pulse shifting, not racing, not panicking, just changing. Coda stepped closer, watching, not excited, not surprised, like this was exactly what he had been trying to show him all along. Caleb wiped his hands against his pants, then looked at the ground again. "All right," he said quietly. Not to Coda, not to himself, to whatever was buried beneath. As Caleb reached for a loose branch nearby to clear more soil, Coda suddenly moved, fast, not aggressive, not afraid, but urgent. He stepped directly between Caleb and the exposed metal, pressing his body forward, blocking him completely. Caleb frowned. "What?" Coda didn't growl, didn't bark. He just stood there, firm, unmoving. And for the first time since they arrived, Coda didn't want him to dig. Caleb slowly lowered the branch. His eyes moved from the dog, back to the ground, then to the surrounding hill. "What do you know that I don't?" he asked quietly. Coda didn't answer, but he didn't move either. The wind shifted again, lighter this time, brushing through the trees above them. And for a brief moment, Caleb thought he felt it. Not a sound, not a voice, just a pressure in the air, like standing near something that had been sealed away too long. He exhaled slowly, then pushed himself to his feet. "Not today," he said. Coda stepped aside, just enough. They walked back down the hill as the last light began to fade. Caleb didn't look back immediately, but when he reached the edge of the clearing, he stopped, turned. The hill stood there, quiet, unchanged, like it had always been. But now he knew. There was something beneath it, something that didn't belong to time, or weather, or nature. Something that had waited, not for him, but for the moment he chose to see it. Coda stood beside him, his silhouette steady against the falling light, not watching the hill anymore, watching Caleb, Caleb Vance stood at the edge of the opening long after the last of the dirt had fallen away. The steel hatch lay exposed now, rectangular, weather-worn, and sealed so tightly into the earth it looked less like something built and more like something buried on purpose. The edges were thick, industrial, the kind of construction meant to outlast decades, maybe longer. Coda stood beside him, breathing slow and steady, not excited, not curious, focused. That was the difference Caleb couldn't shake. Dogs got excited when they found something new. They barked, they circled, they celebrated. Coda did none of that. He simply waited. Caleb crouched, running his fingers along the edge of the hatch. Cold metal met his skin, colder than the surrounding earth, like it held onto something deeper than temperature, like it remembered where it came from. He found the handle after a few seconds, a recessed ring, rusted but intact. "Let's see what you've been chasing," he murmured. He pulled. Nothing. The hatch didn't even shift. Caleb adjusted his stance, boots pressing firmly into the soil. He pulled again, harder this time. The metal groaned faintly but held its ground. Coda stepped back, not retreating, giving space. Caleb exhaled, then stood, scanning the surrounding area. His eyes landed on a length of old timber, half buried near the base of the hill. He dragged it over, wedging it carefully beneath the edge of the hatch. "Come on," he muttered, leaning his weight into it. The wood creaked. The metal resisted. Then, a sharp crack echoed through the quiet clearing. The seal broke. A thin line of dust puffed into the air as the hatch shifted, just enough to let something escape. Cold air, not fresh, not clean, stale, sealed. Caleb froze. That air had been trapped for years, maybe decades. Coda didn't move forward. He lowered his head slightly, nostrils flaring once, then twice. Then he stepped back again. Another step. Deliberate. Caleb noticed. "Yeah, I smell it too," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he actually did or if his mind was catching up to his instincts. He pushed again. The hatch lifted slowly this time, heavy but yielding, revealing a dark opening beneath. Concrete. A ladder. Descending straight into shadow. Caleb stared down into it, his jaw tightening just slightly. No gold, no valuables, just space. Built space. Man-made, purposeful. Coda remained behind him, watching, not the hole. Caleb. The beam of Caleb's flashlight cut into the darkness, revealing just enough to confirm what his instincts already knew. This wasn't a storage pit. It was a structure. The ladder extended down roughly 15 feet before reaching a concrete floor. Beyond that, vague shapes, crates, metal frames, a desk perhaps, sat buried under dust and time. Caleb leaned slightly closer, angling the light. Military. Everything about it felt military. Not improvised, not temporary, designed, built to last. "All right," he muttered under his breath. He turned his head slightly. "You coming?" Coda didn't move. Instead, the dog shifted his stance again, angling his body slightly away from the opening. Not fear, resistance. Caleb studied him for a moment, something in his chest tightening in a way he didn't like to acknowledge. "You don't like it?" Coda held his gaze, didn't blink, didn't step forward. Caleb nodded once. "Yeah, I get that." But he didn't step back. Not this time. He clipped the flashlight to his jacket, tested the first rung with his boot, and began to descend. The air grew colder with every step. Not just temperature, pressure, silence. By the time his boots touched the concrete floor, Caleb felt it settle around him like a weight. The kind of silence that didn't belong in open spaces. He swept the flashlight across the room. Dust covered everything. Thick, undisturbed layers that told a simple truth. No one had been here. For a very long time. The room was larger than it looked from above, roughly the size of a small garage. Concrete walls reinforced with steel beams, a row of wooden crates stacked along one side, a metal desk near the far wall, papers scattered and yellowed with age. Caleb moved slowly, every step measured, the way he used to clear rooms overseas. Not because he expected danger, but because that was how he was built. He approached the nearest crate and brushed his hand across the surface. Letters emerged beneath the dust. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Caleb's breath slowed. Figures, he muttered. He moved to the desk next, picking up a brittle sheet of paper. The ink had faded, but the structure remained. Technical drawings, notes, coordinates. Then his eyes caught something else. A name, typed, clear. Ethan Vance. Caleb didn't move for several seconds. His fingers tightened slightly around the paper, careful not to tear it. "Old man," he said under his breath. There was no anger in his voice, no surprise either. Just recognition. He set the paper down carefully and leaned back slightly, scanning the rest of the room with new eyes. This wasn't just a bunker. This was his father's work. Above him, at the opening, Coda suddenly shifted. Not a bark, not a growl, just movement. Caleb looked up. The dog had stepped forward now, just enough to peer down into the darkness. But his body remained tense, rigid. Then slowly, Coda turned his head. Not toward the trees, not toward the clearing, but toward something behind Caleb. Inside the bunker. Caleb didn't turn immediately. His body reacted before his mind did, muscles tightening, breath slowing, senses sharpening. The old instincts came back without asking permission. He rotated slowly, flashlight sweeping across the far wall. Nothing moved, nothing obvious, just concrete, just shadows. But Coda hadn't been wrong before. Not once. Caleb stepped forward, slower now, scanning every inch. That was when he saw it. A section of wall that didn't quite match the rest. The seams were too clean, the dust too thin. He moved closer, crouching slightly, running his fingers along the surface. Cold, smooth, different. He tapped it. A hollow echo answered back. Caleb leaned back slightly, a faint, humorless smile touching his lips. "Yeah," he murmured. "There it is." He glanced up at Coda again. The dog hadn't moved, still watching, still waiting. Like this part, had always been the point. Caleb climbed back up the ladder slowly, emerging into the late afternoon light. The sky had begun to soften, the harsh brightness fading into something warmer, more forgiving. Coda stepped back as he reached the surface, giving him space again. Caleb stood there for a moment, breathing in the forest air, letting it clear the weight from his lungs. "That's not just a bunker," he said quietly. Coda's ears flicked. "It's something else." The dog didn't react. Didn't need to. Caleb looked back toward the hill, toward the open hatch, toward the place where something had been hidden for longer than he'd been alive. Then he looked at Coda. "You knew." It wasn't a question. Coda held his gaze, steady, unmoving. Caleb let out a slow breath, running a hand through his short dark hair. "Guess I should have listened sooner." The sun dipped lower behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. Caleb stepped forward and pulled the hatch halfway closed, not sealing it completely, but enough to cover the darkness beneath. Not to hide it. Not yet. Just to hold it there. For a moment longer. He turned away and walked back toward the cabin. Coda followed at his side, close but not crowding, his presence steady and grounded like always. Behind them, the hill stood silent again. But it wasn't empty anymore. Not to Caleb. not to Coda, and not to whatever waited beneath that second wall. Caleb didn't sleep much that night. Not because of fear, not even because of what he had seen beneath the hill. It was something quieter than that, something harder to shake. Recognition. The name on that paper hadn't surprised him. Not really. His father had always been a man of edges, someone who knew more than he said, someone who carried silence like it meant something. But seeing it down there, in that place, that had been different. Morning came slowly, light filtering through the tall pines in long, patient beams. The forest didn't rush. It never had. Coda was already awake. He sat near the door, facing outward, his posture alert but not tense, watching as always. When Caleb stepped out onto the porch, the dog turned his head just slightly, enough to acknowledge him, then returned his gaze to the trees. "Didn't miss anything, did you?" Caleb asked quietly. Coda's ears flicked once. Caleb grabbed his jacket and keys. "We're not guessing anymore." The town of Pine Hollow sat about 40 minutes away, tucked between low ridges and narrow roads that curved like they had been drawn by hand. It wasn't much. One main street, a gas station, a diner, and a scattering of buildings that had outlived their original purpose. But it had something Caleb needed, people who remembered. He parked in front of a modest building with a faded wooden sign that read, "Land Records and Forestry Office." Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and dust, old knowledge stacked neatly and left undisturbed. A woman looked up from behind the counter. She was in her mid-30s, standing about 5'7", with a lean, practical build that suggested she spent more time outdoors than in an office. Her hair was chestnut brown, tied back loosely at the nape of her neck, a few strands escaping to frame a face that carried both sharp intelligence and quiet patience. Her skin was lightly freckled from years in the sun, and her eyes, clear hazel, studied Caleb the moment he walked in. This was Lena Brooks, not someone easily surprised. "What can I help you with?" she asked, her voice calm, measured. Caleb stepped forward. "I've got land off Ridgeline, old Vance property." Something flickered in her expression. Recognition. "Thought that place was abandoned," she said. "Not anymore." Her gaze shifted briefly toward the door, toward where Coda sat just outside, visible through the glass. "He yours?" she asked. "Yeah." She nodded once. "He doesn't act like a pet." Caleb's mouth moved just slightly. "He's not." Lena leaned back, folding her arms. "All right. What did you find?" No hesitation, no small talk. Caleb appreciated that. "Something buried," he said. "Military." That was enough. She turned without another word and walked toward a set of shelves behind her, pulling down a thick binder, the kind of record that hadn't been digitized because no one had needed it in decades. "Sit," she said, setting it down. Caleb didn't sit. He stood watching as she flipped through pages, maps, schematics, old government filings. Her fingers moved quickly, but her eyes slowed at certain points, catching details most people would miss. "That land falls under a section that was partially reclassified in the early 60s, she said. "Cold War period. A lot of things got built out here that never made it into public records." She turned the binder toward him. Lines, grids, structural outlines. Caleb scanned it, his training kicking in immediately. "This doesn't match," he said. Lena nodded. "That's because it's incomplete." Caleb looked up. "Parts were removed," she continued. "Intentionally." "Why?" She met his gaze evenly. "Because whatever was there wasn't meant to be found later." "Then we find what's missing," Caleb said. Lena studied him for a moment longer, then nodded once. "There's someone else you should talk to." Noah Briggs lived on the edge of town. in a small workshop that looked like it had been built out of spare parts and stubbornness. The man himself fit the place. Mid-40s, broad-shouldered, but slightly worn down, like life had sanded off his sharper edges over time. His hair was dark, but streaked with early gray, cut short but uneven, like he did it himself. A thick beard covered most of his jaw, not groomed for style, just allowed to exist. His hands were large, calloused, stained with grease and time. Noah had the kind of eyes that didn't trust easily, but didn't lie either. "You brought her?" he said when Lena walked in with Caleb. "She brought me," Caleb replied. Noah grunted. "Fair enough." Lena laid the documents on a workbench. He found something on the Vance property. Noah wiped his hands on a rag and leaned over the papers. His expression changed. Not shock, not surprise. Recognition. "Damn," he muttered. "Didn't think any of that was still there." Caleb stepped closer. "You've seen this before?" "Not exactly," Noah said. "But I've seen the way things get left out." He tapped a section of the blueprint. "This here," he said. "This is where the main structure is supposed to be." Caleb nodded. Noah's finger slid slightly to the side. "But this spacing, it's wrong." "How?" Noah leaned back, crossing his arms. "There's too much empty area." Caleb frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning something else was built there," Noah said. "And they didn't put it on paper." Silence settled between them. Lena looked at Caleb. "An extension?" Noah shook his head slowly. "No." He met Caleb's eyes. Something they didn't want anyone else to know existed. They returned to the cabin by late afternoon. The forest felt different now. Not darker, just aware. Coda was already moving before Caleb even shut off the engine. He headed straight for the hill. No hesitation, no pause. Caleb grabbed a flashlight and followed. Lena stayed close behind, her movements careful but steady. She wasn't trained like Caleb, but she wasn't fragile either. The hatch was where they left it, half covered, waiting. Caleb opened it fully this time without a word and descended. Lena followed after a brief pause. Coda remained above. For now. Inside, the air hadn't changed. Still cold. Still still. Caleb moved toward the far wall immediately, the place he had marked in his mind since the night before. The place Coda had reacted to. He tapped it again. Hollow. Lena knelt beside him, running her fingers along the seams. "You're right," she said quietly. "This isn't original." Caleb stepped back. "Then let's open it." Above them, Coda suddenly barked. Not loud, not frantic, sharp, single. Caleb froze. He looked up instinctively, but before he could move, something else happened. A faint sound. Not from above, from behind the wall. A soft metallic shift, like something inside had just settled. Caleb didn't speak, didn't hesitate. He drove the pry bar into the seam and pulled. The concrete cracked slowly, resisting at first, then giving way piece by piece. Dust filled the air as the section broke open, revealing darkness beyond. Not just a cavity, a room. Hidden, sealed, waiting. Caleb stepped inside first. The beam of his flashlight swept across the space, smaller than the main chamber. More personal. A desk, shelves, boxes. Not military storage, not supply. Something else. Lena stepped in behind him, her breath catching slightly. "What is this?" she whispered. Caleb didn't answer. He was already moving toward the desk. A tape recorder sat on top, old, but intact. Beside it, a stack of notebooks. He picked one up carefully, opened it. The handwriting was unmistakable. Tight, controlled, familiar. His father's. Coda descended the ladder then, finally, slowly, carefully. He entered the room and moved directly to Caleb's side. No hesitation now, no resistance. Like this part was safe, or meant to be seen. Caleb flipped through the pages, dates, observations, notes. Then he stopped, read, and didn't move. Lena watched him. "What is it?" Caleb swallowed once. "Safety clearance logs," he said quietly. "For what?" He didn't look up. For something that shouldn't have been cleared. The room felt smaller suddenly. He turned another page, then another, each line tightening something inside his chest. "The system was failing," he said slowly. "Slow leak. Containment breach." Lena's voice dropped. "Chemical?" Caleb nodded once. "Long-term exposure," he added. "Soil, water." He closed the notebook halfway. "Nothing immediate," he said. "Nothing loud." "That's why no one knew," Lena whispered. Caleb shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "That's why they didn't want anyone to know." He picked up the tape recorder, turning it over in his hands. Dust fell away. Coda sat beside him, still, watching. Caleb pressed the play button. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a voice, rough, measured, familiar. "Ethan Vance, field report." Caleb's grip tightened. "I signed it," the voice continued. "Cleared the system. Said it would hold." A pause, a breath. Then quieter. "I was wrong." The tape crackled softly. "I didn't report it," the voice admitted. "Didn't shut it down." Another pause. Longer this time. "Heavy rains. Soil shift. It's spreading." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Not fast," the voice said. "But enough." Silence, then. "I'll stay," Ethan Vance said. Not a declaration, not pride. Just acceptance. "Someone has to make sure it doesn't get worse." The tape clicked off. Caleb didn't move, didn't speak. The room held him there. Not as a soldier, not as a son, but as something in between. Lena finally exhaled slowly. He knew. Caleb nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. He knew. He set the recorder down gently, his hand lingering there for a moment. Not anger, not grief. Something else. Understanding. Coda leaned slightly against his leg. Not pushing, just there. Caleb rested his hand on the dog's neck. For the first time since he had arrived in this place, his voice softened. "He didn't stay to hide it," he said. Lena looked at him. "He stayed," Caleb continued, "because he didn't know how to fix it. But he couldn't walk away either." The room felt quieter now. Not empty, not heavy, just honest. Caleb stood slowly. "We're not done here," he said. Not a question, a decision. Coda rose beside him, ready. The forest had begun to change. Not dramatically, not in a way most people would notice, but subtly, like a breath held just a little longer than it should have been. The air felt heavier in the mornings, the sunlight sharper as it filtered through the tall northern pines, casting long patterns that seemed to stretch further across the clearing. Caleb noticed it. He noticed everything now. He worked through the day in silence, repairing the old well behind the cabin. The rusted pump had taken more effort than expected, its joints stiff from years of neglect, but his hands moved with practiced precision. Tools clicked into place, bolts tightened, metal groaned and adjusted under pressure. It was familiar. Work like this. It didn't ask questions. It didn't remind him of anything he wasn't ready to face. Coda remained nearby, never more than a few steps away. The German shepherd's movements were measured. His attention split between Caleb and the surrounding forest. Every now and then, he paused, ears tilting, nose catching something unseen. but he no longer returned to the hill. Not today. That alone unsettled Caleb more than if he had. By late afternoon, the sun had softened, its intensity fading into a warm, golden haze. Caleb wiped his hands against his cargo pants and stepped back from the well, testing the handle one last time. Water sputtered out, rust-colored at first, then clearer. "Still works," he muttered. Coda's tail moved once. Caleb gave a faint nod, then turned toward the cabin. That was when he saw the car. It wasn't loud, didn't announce itself. It just appeared. A dark sedan parked at the edge of the dirt road, just beyond the clearing where the trees began to close in again. It didn't belong here. It was too clean, too city. Coda saw it too. He didn't bark, didn't growl, but his body shifted instantly, placing himself slightly ahead of Caleb. Not aggressive, not defensive, aware. The driver's door opened slowly, and she stepped out. Miriam Vance hadn't changed as much as Caleb expected. She stood about 5'6", her posture still straight, still composed, like she had always carried herself in rooms where she needed to be heard without raising her voice. Her hair, once darker, now held subtle strands of ash brown, tied loosely behind her head. A few strands framed her face, soft, deliberate, the kind of detail she used to adjust without thinking. Her features were calm, refined, but there was something new now, something beneath the surface, a weight. Not visible to most, but Caleb saw it. He always had. She wore a long beige coat, simple but well-made, the fabric catching the fading sunlight. No jewelry, no unnecessary detail, just presence. She stepped forward slowly, her eyes moving across the clearing, the cabin, the repaired well, and finally landing on Caleb. She didn't smile, didn't speak right away. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Two people who had once known everything. Now standing at a distance neither of them had planned. Coda moved. Not forward, not backward. Just enough to place himself directly between them. Still. Balanced. Watching. "You look the same," Miriam said finally, her voice softer than Caleb remembered. Caleb tilted his head slightly. "That's supposed to be a compliment?" She exhaled faintly, something close to a smile touching her lips, but not staying long. "I'm not sure." Silence stretched between them again. It wasn't uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. "What are you doing here?" Caleb asked. Miriam didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her coat and pulled out a folded envelope. Worn, old. She held it carefully, like it mattered. "I found this," she said. "A few weeks ago." Caleb's eyes moved to the envelope. His name wasn't on it, but he recognized the handwriting anyway, even from a distance. His father's. "I didn't know what it was at first," Miriam continued. "It was in a box. Things you left behind." Caleb didn't move, didn't reach for it. Miriam stepped closer, but not too close. Coda shifted slightly, adjusting his position, maintaining that invisible line between them. She stopped there. "He wrote it years ago," she said quietly. "Never sent it." Caleb's voice dropped. "What does it say?" Miriam hesitated, not because she didn't want to tell him, but because she wasn't sure how. "There's a lot in it," she said. But one line stood out. She looked at him directly now. "If he ever comes back," she recited slowly, "don't let him be alone." The words settled into the space between them. Heavy, unavoidable. Caleb looked away first, toward the trees, toward the place where things were simpler. He had a way with timing, Caleb muttered. Miriam studied him. I didn't come because of the land. I didn't think you did. I didn't come because of money. Caleb nodded once. Good, there's none here anyway. That almost made her smile. Almost. I came because I didn't understand something, she said. Caleb glanced back at her. What's that? She took a slow breath. You. Coda suddenly stepped forward. Not aggressively, not protectively, but with purpose. He moved just slightly off-center, no longer fully blocking the space between them, but not clearing it either. His eyes shifted between Caleb and Miriam. Then he did something he had never done before. He sat, right between them, not guarding, not warning, just watching, as if waiting for something neither of them had said yet. Caleb looked down at the dog, something unreadable passing through his expression. That's new, he said quietly. Miriam didn't move. He's deciding, she said softly. Caleb let out a faint breath. He's always deciding. Coda didn't react, but he didn't move either. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was measured, careful. Like both of them understood that whatever came next mattered more than anything they had said before. Miriam spoke first. I thought you were shutting down, she said. Back then. Caleb leaned against the edge of the porch railing, his posture relaxed but grounded. I was. I thought you didn't care. I didn't know how to show it. She nodded slowly. I thought you were pulling away from everything. Caleb's eyes met hers again. I was trying to hold it together, he said. There's a difference. Miriam looked down briefly, her fingers tightening slightly around the envelope. I left before I figured that out. Yeah, Caleb said simply. No anger, no accusation, just fact. She took another step forward, slow, cautious, and this time Coda didn't shift, didn't block her. But he didn't relax either. He watched, evaluated. Miriam noticed. He doesn't trust me, she said. Caleb glanced down. He doesn't trust easily. I don't blame him. Coda's ears flicked slightly. Caleb studied her for a moment longer. Why now? He asked. Miriam looked past him, toward the cabin, the forest, the life he had rebuilt, piece by piece. I saw you here, she said. Not literally, but I imagined it. How? She hesitated, then said it anyway. I remembered the way you used to talk to him. She nodded toward Coda, like he was the only one who understood what you couldn't say out loud. Caleb didn't respond. Then I read the letter, she added. And? Miriam looked back at him. And I realized. You didn't change. Caleb's expression didn't shift. You just stayed the same long enough, she said quietly, for me to finally see it. The words didn't land like forgiveness. They landed like truth, and that was harder. Caleb looked out across the clearing, his jaw tightening just slightly. This place, he said after a moment. It's not what it looks like. Miriam frowned. What do you mean? He hesitated, then shook his head. Doesn't matter right now. It matters if I'm staying. That caught his attention. He turned back to her. You're staying? Miriam nodded once. I think I should. Why? She held his gaze. Because someone asked me not to let you do this alone. Caleb exhaled slowly, something shifting behind his eyes. That someone had a habit of making things complicated, he said. Miriam gave a faint, almost tired smile. Sounds like someone else I know. Coda stood then, slowly. He stepped forward, closing the small distance between them, just enough to stand slightly closer to Miriam than before. Not touching, not greeting, but not rejecting either. Caleb noticed. So did Miriam. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The sun dipped lower behind the trees, the light softening into long shadows that stretched across the clearing. Caleb stepped back toward the cabin door. "Well," he said quietly, "you know where everything is?" Miriam nodded. Coda turned his head slightly, watching her again. Not with suspicion this time. With something else. Not trust, not yet, but no longer distance. And for the first time since she arrived, Miriam let herself breathe. The morning felt quieter than it had any right to be. Not empty, just settled, like the forest itself was waiting. Caleb stood on the porch, both hands resting lightly on the worn wooden railing, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the trees. The light came in soft and steady, spilling across the clearing, catching on the edges of the repaired well. The worn steps, the slow rise of the hill behind the cabin. Everything looked ordinary, but nothing was. Behind him, Miriam moved quietly inside the cabin, the soft sound of dishes shifting in the sink carrying faintly through the open door. She hadn't said much since the night before. Neither had he. There were some things words couldn't reach. Coda sat at Caleb's side, not watching the hill, not scanning the tree line, just sitting. For the first time since they had arrived, there was no urgency in him, no restless patrol, no sharp turns of the head at unseen movement. He was still, and that, more than anything, made Caleb uneasy. "You done with it?" Caleb asked quietly, his voice low, almost thoughtful. Coda didn't look up, didn't react. The dog's posture remained calm, grounded, his weight settled evenly through his frame. Present, but not leading. Caleb exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening just slightly. "Yeah," he murmured. "Figured." They went back down into the bunker just after midday. No hesitation this time, no second guessing. Miriam followed behind him, her movements careful but steadier now. She had changed out of her coat, wearing a simple dark sweater and worn jeans, practical, unassuming, as if she had already begun adjusting to the rhythm of this place. Coda descended last. Not reluctantly, but without urgency. He stayed close to Caleb, his shoulder brushing lightly against Caleb's leg as they reached the concrete floor. The hidden room waited exactly as they had left it. The desk, the notebooks, the recorder. Nothing had changed, except Caleb. He moved directly to the desk, picking up the journal again, flipping through pages he had already read, but not fully understood. Not yet. Miriam stood beside him, watching. "You've been thinking about it," she said quietly. Caleb didn't look up. "There's nothing else to do but think." "That's not true." He paused, then glanced at her. "What would you call it?" She held his gaze. "A choice." Caleb closed the journal slowly. The word hung in the air longer than it should have. Choice. It sounded simple. It never was. "If this gets out," he began, his voice steady but low, "he's not remembered as the man who stayed." Miriam nodded slightly. "He's remembered as the man who signed off on something that hurt people." Caleb's eyes drifted toward the wall, unfocused. "He made a call," he said. "Wrong one. And then he stayed to deal with it. That doesn't erase it." "No," she agreed. "But it changes it." Caleb let out a faint breath, something between a sigh and a quiet laugh. "You always did that." "Did what?" "Find the part of the story that made it easier to carry?" Miriam didn't respond right away, because she knew that wasn't what this was. This wasn't about making anything easier. Coda moved, not toward the desk, not toward the wall. He turned slowly, walking to Caleb's side, then sat down deliberately, close enough that his shoulder touched Caleb's leg. Then, Without hesitation, he lowered his head and rested it gently across Caleb's boot. No tension, no alertness, no signal, just wait. Quiet, steady wait. As if for the first time, he wasn't pointing towards something. He was anchoring Caleb to the moment. Caleb looked down at him. Something shifted behind his eyes. "You're not going to tell me this one, are you?" he said softly. Coda didn't move, didn't lift his head, didn't guide. For the first time since all of this had started, Coda had nothing to show him. Miriam noticed it too. "He's done," she said quietly. Caleb's fingers curled slightly at his side. "Yeah," he murmured. "Looks like it." Silence settled around them, heavier now, but not oppressive, just real. Caleb rested his hand against the back of Coda's neck, feeling the steady warmth beneath the thick fur, the calm, controlled breathing. No urgency, no warning, just presence. "This one's on me," Caleb said. Not to Miriam, not even to Coda, to himself. He stood slowly, the decision not loud, not dramatic, but firm. "I could leave it," he said. "Seal it back up. No one would know." Miriam watched him carefully. "Would you?" Caleb shook his head slightly, a faint, humorless smile touching his lips. "No." He looked down at the journal again. At some point, he continued, he knew what was happening. He knew it wasn't contained. Miriam nodded. "And he didn't report it?" "No." Caleb's voice dropped. "He stayed instead." Miriam's eyes softened slightly. "That matters." Caleb met her gaze. "It mattered to him," he said. "But it didn't fix it." The truth settled between them. Simple, unavoidable. Caleb turned, pacing slowly across the room, his boots echoing faintly against the concrete floor. Every step measured, every breath controlled. "That place out there," he said, gesturing vaguely upward, toward the land above. "That water, that soil, it doesn't care what his intentions were." "No," Miriam said quietly. "It doesn't." Caleb stopped, looked back at the desk, at the recorder, at the proof. "If I say nothing," he continued, "everything stays quiet." Miriam stepped forward slightly. "And if you don't?" He held her gaze. "Then everything changes." The words didn't sound dramatic. They didn't need to. They were final enough on their own. Miriam folded her arms loosely, studying him. "You're not trying to protect his name," she said. Caleb shook his head. "No." "Then what are you doing?" He didn't answer right away. Because this part mattered. "I'm finishing it," he said finally. Miriam frowned slightly. "Finishing what?" Caleb's eyes shifted toward Coda, who remained exactly where he was. Calm, grounded, steady. "He stayed," Caleb said, "because he couldn't walk away from what he'd done." Miriam listened. "He carried it," Caleb continued, "day after day. Alone." He exhaled slowly, but he never made it right. Silence. Then, "I can." They climbed back out into the afternoon light together. The forest felt the same. But Caleb didn't. He stood there for a moment, breathing in the air, letting it settle into his lungs. Then he turned toward the cabin. "I'll call Lena," he said. Miriam nodded. "And Noah? He'll hear about it soon enough." Coda stood beside him now, no longer anchored to the ground, but not moving ahead either. Just present. Caleb rested a hand briefly on the dog's neck. "Good call," he said quietly, not because Coda had told him what to do, but because he hadn't. Because for the first time, Caleb had made the decision without being led. And somehow, that mattered more. The truth didn't arrive like a storm. There were no sirens, no flashing lights cutting through the trees, no sudden rush of strangers pouring into the quiet clearing as if something catastrophic had just been uncovered. It came the way most truths did, slowly, deliberately, and without asking anyone's permission. Caleb stood at the edge of the hill as the first vehicle arrived 2 days later, a white government truck, clean but unmarked except for a small insignia near the door. It rolled carefully up the narrow dirt road, stopping just short of the clearing. The engine idled for a moment before shutting down. Coda sat beside Caleb, still. No tension, no warning, just presence. The driver stepped out first. A man in his early 50s, tall and broad-shouldered but not imposing, his movements measured and efficient. His hair was cut short, dark with streaks of gray at the temples, and his face carried the kind of structure that had once been sharper but had softened over time. Less from age, more from experience. His eyes, though, steady, observant, took in everything. This was Dr. Samuel Carter, environmental response specialist. Not the kind of man who rushed into situations, the kind who studied them until they told the truth. He adjusted his gloves as he approached, his boots pressing softly into the earth. "You Caleb Vance?" he asked. Caleb nodded once. "That's me." Carter glanced briefly at Coda. "That your partner?" Caleb looked down. "Yeah." Carter gave a faint nod, like that made sense to him. "Good dog." Coda didn't react. Carter shifted his attention back to Caleb. "You said there was a containment issue tied to an old core installation." "Yeah." Carter looked past him, toward the hill. "You mind showing me?" Caleb turned without a word. They walked together. More vehicles followed over the next few hours. Quietly, professionally. Men and women in neutral uniforms, their movements coordinated but unhurried. Equipment was unloaded, markers placed, samples taken. No chaos, no panic. Just work. Miriam stood off to the side near the cabin, watching. She hadn't said much since Caleb made the call. Not because she disagreed, not because she didn't understand, but because she knew what it cost him, and she respected that silence. By midday, the hill no longer felt like a secret. It felt like a responsibility. Carter stood at the edge of the open hatch, studying the interior with careful attention. His posture remained calm, but his eyes moved with precision, noting details most would miss. "This was sealed well," he said. "Better than most." Caleb crossed his arms loosely. "Wasn't enough." "No," Carter agreed. "It rarely is." He stepped back, removing his gloves briefly, running a hand along his jaw in thought. "You were right to report it," he said after a moment. Caleb didn't respond, because that wasn't why he had done it. Coda shifted suddenly, not sharply, not urgently, but enough to draw Caleb's attention. The dog stood and moved a few steps forward, stopping at the edge of the marked perimeter where the team had placed temporary flags around the contaminated zone. He didn't cross it, didn't sniff, didn't investigate. He simply stood there, looking down at the ground. Then, slowly, he sat, and turned his head back toward Caleb. Not asking, not guiding, just acknowledging, as if to say, "This is where it ends." Caleb felt something settle in his chest. Not relief, not quite, but something close to completion. He stepped forward, stopping just short of the same line Coda had respected. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Caleb nodded once. "Yeah," he said quietly. The work continued into the afternoon. Carter and his team moved efficiently, taking soil samples, marking zones, documenting everything with quiet precision. There were no dramatic discoveries, no sudden revelations, just confirmation. The kind that mattered more than anything else. By the time the sun began to lower, Carter returned to Caleb. "The contamination is contained to a manageable area," he said. "Your father—" He slowed it down. Caleb's eyes lifted slightly. Not stopped. "No," Carter said. "But without intervention back then, this would have spread a lot further." Caleb absorbed that without visible reaction. "He made a bad call," Carter continued, his tone steady. "But he didn't walk away from it." Caleb nodded once. "I know." Carter studied him for a moment longer, then added, "We'll handle the rest. This area will be restricted, monitored. Cleanup protocols will take time, but it's fixable." Fixable. The word carried weight, not redemption, but something close enough to stand beside it. Miriam approached slowly after Carter stepped away. "You did it," she said. Caleb shook his head slightly. "No." She studied him. "Then what would you call it?" He looked out across the clearing, toward the cabin, toward the life he had begun rebuilding piece by piece. "I finished something that should have been done a long time ago," he said. Miriam nodded. She understood. That evening felt different. Not lighter, not easier, but clearer. The air moved through the trees without resistance. The sounds of the forest returned to their natural rhythm, wind through pine, distant birds, the soft shift of branches settling into place. Nothing hidden, nothing waiting, just what was. Caleb sat on the porch steps, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the last light faded behind the trees. Coda lay beside him, relaxed, truly relaxed, not watching, not listening, just there. Miriam stood in the doorway for a while before stepping out. She moved quietly, as she always had, sitting down beside Caleb without crowding him. "You're not the same," she said after a moment. Caleb let out a faint breath. "Neither are you." She smiled slightly. "That's probably a good thing." He nodded once. They sat in silence again. But this time, it wasn't unfamiliar. It wasn't something to fill. It was something to share. "I'm leaving in the morning," Miriam said finally. Caleb didn't look at her right away. "Yeah," he said. There was no question in it. No attempt to stop her. Because this time, he understood. She wasn't leaving to escape. She was leaving because she didn't need to stay. And neither did he. The morning came clean and bright. Sunlight broke through the tall northern pines, scattering gold across the clearing. The air was crisp, carrying that quiet promise of a day that didn't need to prove anything. Caleb sat on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand. Coda lay beside him, stretched out comfortably, his breathing slow and even. No patrol, no tension, no searching. Miriam stood near her car, one hand resting lightly on the door. She looked at the cabin one last time, then at Caleb. "You'll be all right?" she said. It wasn't a question. Caleb nodded. "I know." She hesitated for a moment longer, then added, "He would have been proud." Caleb didn't answer immediately, because that wasn't something you responded to quickly. Finally, he said, "I think he just wanted it finished." Miriam smiled softly. "Maybe that's the same thing." She got into the car, the engine starting with a quiet hum. Coda didn't move, didn't follow, didn't react. He just watched. As the car disappeared down the road, the clearing returned to silence. Not empty, not waiting, just complete. Caleb took a slow sip of coffee, his eyes drifting toward the hill. The markers were still there. The work wasn't finished, but it was no longer hidden. and that changed everything. Coda shifted slightly beside him, stretching his legs before settling again, his head resting lightly against Caleb's boot. Caleb reached down, resting his hand against the dog's neck. No words. No need. The sunlight moved through the trees, catching on the edges of the world they had chosen to stay in. And for the first time since everything had begun, there was nothing left to dig for, nothing left to uncover. Because what mattered most had never been buried in the ground. It had been carried, quietly, patiently, until someone was ready to face it. And now, he was. There are moments in life when everything seems lost, when the ground beneath you feels empty, and the silence around you feels too heavy to carry. But sometimes, what we call loss is not the end. It is the quiet beginning of something God has been preparing all along. Maybe the miracle is not in finding something buried beneath the earth. Maybe the miracle is in being guided back to what truly matters by something as simple, as loyal, and as pure as a companion who never leaves your side. Because God doesn't always speak in loud ways. Sometimes, He speaks through instincts, through quiet moments, through the presence of those who stand with us when no one else does. In everyday life, we often look for answers in the wrong places, chasing after things we think we've lost. But the truth is, what we need most is already within us. The strength to face the truth, the courage to make the right choice, and the grace to forgive others and ourselves. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to share it with someone who might need a reminder that they are not alone. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from, because your story matters too. And don't forget to subscribe to Veteran Dog Stories, because there are many more journeys like this waiting to be told. May God watch over you, guide your steps, and bring peace to your heart, no matter where you are or what you are facing today.